Eleanor Ashworth had not cried in 11 months, and she considered this a kind of victory, though a hollow one. She kept the flower shop the way she kept herself, swept clean, arranged just so, nothing left out of place that might catch the light, wrong, and remind her of what she'd lost. Ashworth Bloom sat on the corner of Larkspur and Ninth, its bell chiming politely every time a customer wandered in for a bouquet they didn't really need, and Elle had learned to greet them all with the same practiced warmth, the kind that asked nothing and revealed nothing in return. Her husband, Desmond, had been gone 3 years that spring, a heart that gave out on an ordinary Tuesday. No warning, no goodbye, just an empty chair at breakfast the next morning. Since then, Elle had built her life into a small, manageable shape: the shop, her sister's Sunday phone calls, the blue hyacinths she kept in the front window because Desmond had loved them, though she never told anyone why. It was a Thursday in March when the first letter appeared. No stamp, no return address, tucked beneath the shop's welcome mat, where only someone paying very close attention would have thought to look. The handwriting was looping and careful, the kind of penmanship no one practiced anymore. You keep the hyacinths in the window because someone you loved once stopped to smell them on a Tuesday morning. I don't know his name, but I know he was lucky. Elle read it 3 times, standing in the doorway, her heart doing something unfamiliar and unwelcome, quickening. She told herself it was nothing, a strange coincidence. A customer, perhaps, being sentimental. She tucked it into the drawer beneath the register and didn't think about it again until the second letter arrived, 4 weeks later, folded into the pages of her delivery invoice. You rearrange the roses when you think no one's watching, moving the wilting ones to the back so they don't discourage the fresh buyers. It's a kindness you don't think anyone notices. I notice. By the third letter, Elle had begun watching the doorway of her own shop the way she once watched hospital corridors, desperate, afraid to hope, unable to stop. The letters came monthly, each one carrying some small, specific truth about her life that no casual observer should have known. The way she hummed old hymns while watering the ferns. The way she always ordered 1 extra cup of coffee on Desmond's birthday and left it, untouched, on the counter until it went cold. She began to suspect people. Grant Pemberton, who bought carnations every Friday for his mother's grave and lingered a little too long at the counter. The postal carrier, a quiet young man named Silas, who always tipped his hat. Even her own accountant, a fussy, kind man, who reviewed her books twice a year and once complimented her handwriting. None of them fit. The letters were too precise, too patient. Written by someone who had watched her not for weeks, but for years. Someone who had been paying attention long before the letters began. Long enough to know things Elle herself had forgotten. She did. Her sister, Cordelia, noticed the change first. "You're humming again," she said, one Sunday, suspicious and delighted in equal measure. "You haven't hummed since the funeral." Elle didn't tell her about the letters. She didn't know how to explain that a stranger's handwriting had done what 3 years of grief, counseling and well-meaning friends had failed to do. It had made her curious about her own life again. She started noticing the color of the sky in the mornings. She repainted the shop's back room a soft, buttery yellow, because the 6th letter had mentioned, almost in passing, that yellow suited her better than the gray she'd painted everything since Desmond died. By autumn, she had received 8 letters, and she had started, without quite admitting it to herself, to fall in love with a person she had never met. The 9th letter frightened her. I am running out of ways to say this without saying it plainly, so here it is plainly. I think of you more than is wise for a man my age to think of anyone. I have watched you build a life out of the pieces grief left behind, and I have never once wanted to disturb that rebuilding by making it about myself. But I am afraid, Eleanor, that time is a thing I have less of than I once believed, and I find I cannot bear the thought of you never knowing that you were loved, quietly and completely, by someone who never had the courage to say so to your face. She sat with that letter for 3 days. Time is a thing I have less of. She read it as metaphor, then as confession, then as something closer to warning, and each time it frightened her more. The 10th letter didn't come. Weeks passed. October gave way to November, and the flower shop grew quiet, the way it always did before winter, and Elle found herself standing at the window each morning, watching the doorway for an envelope that never arrived. She realized, with a kind of sick clarity, that she had been counting on those letters the way she once counted on Desmond's voice calling up the stairs each evening. She had built a small, secret hope around a stranger's handwriting, and now the hope had gone silent, and she didn't know what to do with the silence. It was Cordelia's grocery run that finally connected the pieces. "Did you hear about old Mr. Whitlock?" her sister asked one evening, setting down a bag of onions on Elle's counter. "Thaddeus, from Birch Lane, collapsed in his garden back in October. His heart, they think. He's been at Marymount ever since." Elle's hands went still around the ribbon she was tying. Thaddeus Whitlock, the elderly widower who lived 2 streets over, whose garden she passed every morning on her walk to the shop, whose roses, she realized now, with the letters rushing back to her all at once, had always been the most beautifully kept on the block. She had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in 3 years. Small, polite exchanges about weather and roses. She had never once considered that a man in his 70s, tending his garden alone every morning at the exact hour she walked past it, might have been watching her far more closely than she'd ever watched him. "Elle?" Cordelia was staring at her. "You've gone white as a sheet." She didn't answer. She was already reaching for her coat. Marymount Hospital smelled the way all hospitals smelled: antiseptic and quiet dread. And Elle hated it instantly, hated the fluorescent lights and the hush of the corridors, hated how much it reminded her of the last place she'd seen Desmond alive. She found Thaddeus's room by asking 3 separate nurses, and when she finally stood in the doorway, she almost turned back. He looked smaller than she remembered, propped against white pillows, an oxygen line beneath his nose, his hands folded on top of the blanket, the way a man folds his hands when he's trying to look composed and failing. A young man sat beside the bed. His grandson, Micah, Elle would learn, the one who'd been slipping the letters under her mat each month because his grandfather's hands had grown too unsteady for the walk. Thaddeus looked up, and something in his face cracked open: surprise, then fear, then a kind of naked, unguarded hope that made Elle's chest ache. "You weren't supposed to find out this way," he said, his voice thin but steady. "I wanted to write one more letter, a last one, to explain properly so you wouldn't feel," he stopped, swallowed, "so you wouldn't feel obligated to come here and be kind to a foolish old man." "You're not foolish," Elle said, and her voice broke on the words. 3 years of careful composure finally giving way. "You watched over me for 3 years and never asked for anything back. You noticed things about my own grief that I didn't even notice myself. You gave me back the parts of my life I thought I'd buried with my husband." She crossed the room and sat in the chair. Micah quietly vacated, taking Thaddeus's hand in both of hers. "That isn't foolish, Thaddeus. That might be the least foolish thing anyone has ever done for me." He looked at her for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice had softened into something almost boyish. "I used to watch you from my garden every morning, and I told myself it was harmless, an old man's small comfort. But then I started writing things down, just to have somewhere to put all that noticing, and before I knew it, I was writing to you instead of about you. I never meant to fall in love with a woman 30 years younger than myself. At the age of 73, it seemed, frankly, like poor timing." Elle laughed a real laugh, wet with tears. The first one she'd let herself have in longer than she could remember. "I think," she said, "that love has never once cared about good timing." The doctors were cautiously optimistic. A narrowed artery, caught in time. A surgery scheduled for the following week that carried real hope of a full recovery. Elle visited every day that Thaddeus was in the hospital, bringing him hyacinths from the shop window, the same ones Desmond had once loved. And somewhere in those quiet visits, grief and gratitude braided themselves into something new, something that didn't erase what she'd had with Desmond, but made room, gently, for what might come next. Thaddeus came home in December. Elle was there to help him through the door, and when he settled into his favorite chair by the window overlooking his garden, he reached for her hand without hesitation, as though the year of anonymous letters had already made this her hand in his. Unhidden, ashamed, the most natural thing in the world. "I have one more letter," he told her that evening, pulling a folded envelope from the drawer of his side table. "The one I meant to send last. Mike has had it for weeks." Elle opened it slowly, her thumb tracing the familiar looping handwriting one final time. "Eleanor, if you're reading this, it means my courage finally caught up to my heart. One way or another. I don't know what comes next for either of us, but I know this. Watching you rebuild your life, flower by flower, taught me more about courage than 70 years of my own living ever did. Whatever time I have left, I would be honored to spend some small portion of it beside you, not as a stranger in letters, but as a man who finally found the nerve to say, in person, that he loves you." She folded the letter carefully and pressed it against her chest, and for the first time in 3 years, she let herself believe that love could arrive quietly, without warning, tucked beneath a doormat, and still be exactly the kind of love worth staying for. The following spring, Ashworth Blooms hung a small new sign in its window, hand-painted by Thaddeus himself during his recovery. "Est reopened, with hope." The blue hyacinths remained in the window, joined now by a second vase of white roses from Thaddeus's garden, and every customer who wandered in and asked about the framed, yellowed letter, hanging quietly by the register, received the same soft, unguarded smile from Elle, and the same simple answer. "That's the letter that taught me love doesn't need a name to be real. It just needs someone brave enough to write it down."